Hello, everybody. I'm Karin Hoskin. So good to see you all tonight. I guess it is tonight. I'm the executive director of the Cohousing Association of the U.S. And so glad to have you guys here, and so glad to say that we're continuing to offer this web chat series, which is really fantastic. Being able to offer these little kind of mini things. So the plan for tonight is that there's going to be a short presentation. Karen, what, about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes? And then it'll be open to questions and discussions. So our speaker tonight is Karen Gimnig. She is the Assistant Director of the Cohousing Association of the U.S. So she and I work together all day, every day, doing all kinds of stuff. She lives in Eastlake Commons near Atlanta. She is a professional facilitator with Imago Relationships, and tonight is talking about clear contracting within community and how that can make meetings more efficient and effective. So, Karen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few slides to share here. And excited to be with you all. Thanks for being here. So contracting and facilitation, and I actually got some feedback that I was using a bit of sort of professional speak there, contracting not being a term a lot of folks are familiar with facilitation. So I thought I would start with just sort of a definition of what I'm talking about, especially if my screen will, there we go. So contracting really is more or less what it sounds like. It's making an agreement with a person or a group. And some examples of what that might look like in a community kind of situation or in a meeting when you're facilitating would be getting consent on an agenda, getting agreement about what the length of the meeting might be, what sort of facilitation method you're going to use, how much time you're going to spend on a particular topic, things of that nature. And I'll talk in more detail about those as we go. But that's what I mean when I say contracting in a facilitation context. That's what I'm talking about. I want to pause just and mention relationships, because this is sort of my assumption in terms of any work that I do in community, is that relationships are the primary objective of every community. So that's my assumption. And other assumptions that I make are that good facilitation prioritizes relationships over work, meaning if I have to choose when I'm facilitating a meeting whether I'm going to do the thing that's going to keep the relationships in the community solid and working well, or push through and try to get a bunch of decisions made, as a general rule, I'm going to prioritize the relationship side. And that is in part because I really believe that strong relationships make the work more efficient. So those are sort of my assumptions starting out. So I'm always sort of tracking what is going on with relationships and what we're doing in terms of how we run our meetings. The other concept I want to mention right off at the beginning is trust. And for me, trust is the most important element of facilitation. If the people you're working with do not trust you, your ability to work with them is going to be pretty limited. It's an essential piece of safety. So if there isn't trust, you're going to need to go back and work on that some before you're going to get very far. And contracting is a big part of that, I think. And the last sort of major concept I want to talk about before I get into more of the nuts and bolts is the concept of power. We tend in community to want power to be equally distributed, and it's not, is sort of the short version. There is always people that have more power or less. And in community, the way power shows up is, the sort of definition I like to use is that power is the ability to influence others. And so that shows up a lot in community. And if you are the facilitator, it's worth noting that you are in a power position, that is just a natural sort of inherent in the position of the facilitator, is a great deal of power within that meeting. And so you want to know that and hold that carefully, and just have that consciousness. And there may be other power holders in the meeting for various reasons, but knowing that that's a piece of being the facilitator. There is a recent book and some articles out there under the title of The Power Paradox, and I don't know if I'll say this guy's name correctly, but Dr. Keltner is the author. And I put this quote in here because I think it helps us think about facilitating and what happens to us as facilitators relative to this power position. And what he says is, we gain power and the capacity for influence through social practices that advance the interests of others, such as empathy, collaboration, open-mindedness, fairness, and generosity. And I'll pause there and note that I think those are excellent qualities to have in a facilitator. And then he says, and despite all of that, and yet, once we gain power, success, or wealth, those very practices vanish, leaving us vulnerable to impulsive, self-serving actions and empathy deficits that set in motion our fall. And I think that also can happen in the facilitation context, so that we get into this position as a facilitator where we've been given that position and the power that goes with it by the community or by the committee that decides facilitators, however that happens. Once we're in that position for various reasons, we can get pretty attached to that, and it can lead us astray. And so what I call the facilitator's paradox is that you begin a meeting with this implicit contract. So probably nobody quite said it out loud, but that you were, for whatever reason, you were assigned that role of facilitator by the community. And everyone walking into the room is expecting you to stand up at the front and say, we're going to do this next and that the next and whatever. So there is that expectation is already there. And with that comes a sense of responsibility for getting the work done, for keeping the meeting running. And inevitably, if you facilitate long enough, I can guarantee that at some point the community is going to challenge the facilitator. You will be challenged, and people will say, wait, why are we doing it that way? Or I think we're spending too long on this. Or you shouldn't be facilitating because you have an opinion about this. Or wherever that comes from, there's going to be pushback against this role that you've been given. And I think there is this instinctive piece that when that happens, we want to defend that power because we feel the responsibility that goes with it. And as soon as we do that, we begin to lose our influence in the community. So there is that power paradox, I think, plays out pretty consistently. And so the contracting piece comes in because we want to disrupt that pattern. We want to get to a place where when we get challenged, because that's going to happen, we kind of know what to do with that challenge. And so what I recommend is really clear, transparent contracting. So as I said, when you walk into the room as a facilitator, you have an implicit contract. You're going to stand at the front of the room and you're going to say, we're doing this next, and this person's going to talk next, and that kind of thing. And there's probably an agenda. You want to make that implicit contract explicit. So you want to name particularly the agenda and get consent or consensus around that agenda. It doesn't have to be a formal consensus round or recorded as a consensus decision, but you do want to get agreement in at least an informal way. You want people to have had an opportunity to say, wait, no, we need the agenda to be something different. And I always like to confirm the time. Most communities have a pretty consistent, a meeting is always an hour and a half, or it's always 2 hours, or whatever that is. But I think it's worth confirming that contract at the beginning of each meeting. We're all planning to be here for 2 hours. Is that what we're doing? And just check in with that. And so that's sort of routine pieces. And then the next piece is to really contract what your methods will be. And that's not necessarily all at the beginning of the meeting. That's sort of, each piece as we go. But, you want to say something like, what I thought we would do here is, maybe we're going to let somebody present on something, and then we'll take questions, and then we'll have a consent round. Or, I thought a good way to do this would be to break into groups. Does that work for everyone? Whatever your plan is for how you're going to handle that particular topic, you just want to check in and give people a chance to consent to that plan. And that's just, it's a matter of respect. But also you're getting the group buy-in. And by getting the group buy-in, you're less likely to run into a situation where people feel like they're being overpowered by you. And so you're going to get more sense of safety and trust in the room. The question that comes up always is, well, what if they say no? You know, you've planned this meeting and you've got your agenda laid out, and you know, you figured out how to fit everything in. A lot of times there's more on the agenda than fits easily, so you've sort of worked that out ahead. And you come in and you say, okay, well, this is what I'm planning, and you know, is that okay with everybody? And somebody says, no, it's not okay. I think we're spending too much time on that, or whatever it is that they're saying. And so what do you do with that as this facilitator that's trying to get a meeting done? And now you've invited people to give their opinion about how you're planning to do it, and they say, no, we don't want that. And the first thing is to be respectful of the objection. I always recommend a mirror, and if you've seen my other web chat or done anything that I've been teaching, this is one of my standard tools. But what that means is just to respond back to that person with, okay, so what I think you're saying is, or what I'm hearing you say is, and repeat back to them what their concern was, or what it was that they had to say about the agenda, or whatever the piece you were trying to contract is. And be genuinely curious. Where is this coming from? What is it that they're needing? What need that they have is not being met? Sometimes simply being heard is actually what's going on. So when you mirror them back and they sense that respect, they can pretty quickly let go of the direction they want to go. Sometimes they have a need that you didn't think of, and it's totally appropriate to shift the agenda or the plan or allow more time than you were expecting. So be open to that as well. And then the next piece, once you've responded to the individual, is to check in with the group. You may want to state your reasons for the original plan. I mean, presumably going into this meeting, you've given things some thought. There's a reason why you wanted to do it the way you wanted to do it that they may not know. I mean, no one in the group might know what you were thinking. I encourage you to state those reasons from a place of sort of your own beliefs. So, you know, what I think will work well, or the reason I think this will work well, or, you know, based on my experience, I would expect that this would be a good idea, because you want to avoid good facilitation practice is, or other sort of, I know what I'm doing and nobody else could challenge me kinds of language. You want to you really want to own it as if this is your belief and your recommendation. And you can certainly bring up the costs of changes. So for example, you know, if we take more time on this, then that means we're not going to get to this other thing that was also important. Or I'm concerned that if we do this in a less, you know, a shorter time, that we're not going to get into the depth around it or the complexity that seems like it really needs to have when people are concerned about it, or whatever your reasons were for wanting to do it the way that you want to. You can share those, but again, you want to share them from a place of a certain amount of humility and really owning that they're your own beliefs, and not do the sort of I'm the expert, so you have to listen to me and I must be right kind of language, which, by the way, is such a natural part of our culture when we get challenged that it's pretty normal to go to that expert kind of talk. So I just will encourage you to avoid that. And then check in with the group to see what the group wants to do. This does not have to be a sort of standoff between you and the person objecting. You really want to check in with the group. And if the group really wants to go the other way, you want to keep in mind that this is not your meeting, this is the meeting for the group. And if there, you know, is a desire to shift, then you want to be open to that. My experience is that usually, if I feel pretty strongly about it and I have good reasons that I've expressed in it, you know, I've really heard the objection and I still want to do what I thought was going to be best for the group, and I have my reasons for that, most of the time someone else in the group chimes in and says, you know, hey, Karen's really thought about this. I think we should try it her way. So usually some sort of support comes up. And at some point you can sort of seek consensus again and sort of check back in with the person who brought the objection and say, would you be willing to, try this, let us try it out this way, see how it goes, and then we can evaluate it at the end, or, or would you be willing to do it if maybe we just did it for 5 minutes less, or what, just whatever makes sense given what their objection was and what you feel like was best for the meeting. But in the end, you want to be in that consensus place around it so that you're doing what the group feels like is right for the group. And hopefully there's enough respect already built in that that people are willing to say, hey, this is the person who's really given this some thought and made a plan, and generally groups will go along with that. If they're not, I'd get real curious about what's going on that they're not. And you may have a deeper problem you want to sort through. I want to talk a little bit about natural defenses. So this is that moment that happens when you've put all this work into planning a meeting and you go in and you're ready to have your meeting, and then somebody says, no, wait, I don't think that's a good way to do it. It is the most natural thing in the world to try to defend your role and your work and your plan, all from the very best place, right? Like, it's because you want it to be a good meeting and you care about the meeting and you care about the community. But I know how this goes because I've done it myself so many times. These are traps I've fallen into. It is completely natural when you have that power of the facilitator to want to hold on to it. And so I just want to name that as a normal thing so you can watch yourself for it. Some of the stories that I said we tell ourselves to retain our power, I could say stories that I have told myself when I was feeling threatened and wanting to defend my role. I've said, hey, I'm responsible for getting the work done at this meeting. I've got to stick to the plan or we're not going to get all the way through it. That tends to backfire because if I'm at odds with people in the meeting, as soon as there's a power struggle, that is now all that the meeting actually is going to be about, is the power struggle. So it doesn't actually work to get the work done, but it's an enticing story if you're the one telling it. Another story is, well, I was given this authority. Like they don't get to decide what happens at the meeting because I was given the authority to decide what happens at the meeting. And again, that authority is only yours as long as the group is still giving it to you. As soon as there's a challenge, it's not likely to serve you well to hold on to it. And then the third message is, hey, it's my job to control this meeting. It's my job to make sure that things don't get out of hand and we don't let that one person sidetrack us and so on. And while there is a role in a facilitator to keeping the meeting on track, if you do that by sort of that power over controlling kind of way, the cost to relationships is so high that it won't, I think, have been worth it. So those are just some of the easy traps, I think, to fall into. Yeah, just to be aware of those. And so in contrast to those, I'm offering stories that I'm calling relationship resilience. So when you find yourself in that position of being challenged and, having objections to how you're wanting to run the meeting and you're having to recontract things, some alternative stories that we can tell ourselves instead. One is that relationships are more important than getting work done at this meeting. Another is, I'm here to support the group in what the group wants to do. So that's shifting from I'm supposed to be taking care of everything to, hold on, I'm in a support role. I'm in a leadership role, but it's a support role. And then the third story is that my role is to build trust and safety for all. So if there's somebody that's objecting to something, there's probably a safety kind of need under that. And my job is to figure that out and help them feel safe and connected in the meeting. Oh, there, I missed a slide. So I want to say just a word about mini contracts, because this is another version of contracting that I think is worth noting. And mini contracts are just little tiny contracts that you might use throughout a meeting. And most often these are going to be things that really you're contracting with just one person around as opposed to the whole group. But when you're shifting something, when there's something someone might object to or not feel good about, Certainly, anytime you're going to put someone on the spot in any way, you want to get their permission to do that. So a few examples, one would be, you know, hey, I want to follow this thread, which means I'm going to delay your turn. Is that okay with you? Most of the time they'll say it is, but it changes the whole dynamic of it if they know that, for one thing, you're letting them know that you know it was their turn, but you're also getting their okay to shift the order. So that would be an example of the mini contract. Another would be, I want to understand more about your comment. Is it okay if I ask you some questions? So that's that example where you're putting someone on the spot in a way, and you want to get their permission before you do that. That would also be true if you were wanting to do any kind of fishbowl activity or anything that's going to draw attention to a particular person. You want to get permission from that person before you do that. And another example and this is an example where you're probably talking to the whole group, but you know, we're running short on time. Is it okay if we go over by 5 minutes or something like that? You want to check in with folks and not just assume that you can go over. People don't like to feel like they're being held captive. And sometimes they'll say, hey, I really can't stay. And sometimes somebody will say, I can't stay, but go on, you know, but go ahead, that's fine. Other times they'll say, you know, I can't stay. And then you've got to figure out what you're going to do about that, but at least you have that information to work with. A few final thoughts. Being prepared always makes contracting easier. So you want to make sure that you've got a plan for your meeting. Being respectful does not mean being a pushover. You can still be the leader and the guide and the director of the meeting, while at the same time totally respecting objections to how you're doing it. Only contract that which you can deliver. So if you make a contract with someone around something like, we're not going to talk about that agenda item this meeting, we will put it on next month's agenda or something like that, don't say that unless you're really sure you can do it. Broken contracts will break trust, so you want to make sure. When you make mistakes, say so. So if you've contracted with someone, you know, we're only going to do 20 minutes on this topic, and then you're going over, you want to pause at that 20-minute mark, or maybe 15 even, and say, hey, it looks like we're going to take longer on this, and, you know, need to shift this agenda time and recontract that. Or, you know, if you've missed someone in the rotation or whatever that is, you want to let them know. If you own it, then you'll probably get forgiveness for having broken a contract. And the last thing I'll say is, if you feel really vulnerable, you're probably doing it right. It is a scary thing to stand up in front of a group with a well-planned meeting and say, hey, is it okay if we do what I plan to do? Because people might say no. And then you've got to figure it out. And that is harder in some ways than going with sort of the script you had planned. But in my experience, it leads to much more effective meetings and much better relationships in the long run to have had that opportunity to talk back and forth. So that is what I brought as a prepared piece. And I would love to hear questions or thoughts or experiences, any of that.
I think you did a great job of explaining this in a short period of time. I really admire that. I want to go back and think about all these things very carefully. Thank you very much. We'd have you here doing all of our meetings. Except that this month we need a chainsaw, you know? So thank you.
Well, thank you. If you can keep that blue sky, I'll come anytime.
All right.
I have a question that what Dean just said made me think of something. So typically with just a standard, like a standard monthly community general meeting, we don't have a professional facilitator there. So it's somebody from process or whatever, however they are in the community, but there's generally a person or a group of people that are the ones that volunteer to facilitate the meetings, and they may or may not have facilitation experience. So my question is, well, I guess my first question is is that okay? And I guess I don't, doesn't really matter if it's okay or not. That's what the reality is usually. So I guess more my question is how can, what contract or at what point is the contract identified so that somebody can be a facilitator, but also still be a participant because they're a community member. And so whatever it is that's being discussed, they will need to, take their facilitator hat off and chime in with their opinions as a community member.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the trickiest parts of facilitating co-housing meetings is that it's pretty much always a member of the community that's doing the facilitating. And I think it's okay. I think it's more than okay. I think it's particularly okay if the community is somehow investing in some kind of training, particularly early on. I mean, there's a point at which you've got some skilled facilitators that then pass that knowledge on, both by modeling and by sometimes actual deliberate instruction or partnering or that kind of thing. But I absolutely recommend to forming communities to get some facilitation training for at least some of your members and maybe all of them. And then in terms of that dual role, it's tricky. And I think there are a few ways to handle it. One is, I think there are times when I know that I, as a community member, there are topics that I'm not that invested in, or I know that there's a, the ideas that I would want to make sure came to it are represented in the community already. So I just go into it deciding that I can just stay in my neutral facilitator role because the things that need to be said are going to be said. If I know I feel really strongly, particularly if I feel strongly and I'm sort of at one end of the spectrum of thoughts on a topic, I don't facilitate that topic. You will get yourself in trouble in a heartbeat if you facilitate something where you feel really strongly and want to share. Even if you manage to separate the two roles well, the likelihood of the community thinking that you didn't is pretty high anyway. And then I do think you can do exactly what you were saying, Karin, about if you are facilitating a topic that you want to add a comment, then you just have to be very, very clear. I'm stepping out of my facilitator role to take my turn in this round, or whatever that is, and say what it is that you want to say about it. So any of those possibilities, and just because you're not facilitating that topic doesn't mean you can't facilitate the rest of the meeting either. Facilitating in pairs is always a good idea, and then hopefully at least one of you is not so strongly invested in the topic that you need to hand it off. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
I think so.
I have a more general question.
Okay.
How would a community, whether they're forming or established, but if they see the value in having some facilitator training, there's a fair amount of different methods, if you will, out there. Mm-hmm. How would a community kind of decide what method to use, or who to get trained from? Like how do you do that?
Yeah. So one answer is variety is great. So I don't know that you need to choose. I'm a big fan of put as many tools in your toolbox as you can. So if you to the extent that there's variety available to you and you're able to access variety, go for it. Conferences are a great place for that, because then you can attend different people's talks and intensives, and if 5 people from your community are going to conference, go to 5 different facilitator training sessions if you can, and then compare notes. So in that way, I don't know that you have to choose. But if you're bringing someone in for training or choosing to work with someone remotely to get support for facilitation, then obviously, you're going to choose a professional that you're going to pay for that consult. And you want to just go with a person that feels like they resonate with you, for somebody who fits your budget if that's a factor. If there's somebody in your local area, then that can reduce the cost and make it easier to bring them in more often if you wanted to. But anything that would, just get to know them. So again, conferences are a great way because pretty much all of us go to those, so you can get to know us. And I think the web chats are a really good way that you can get a taste of what is that person's approach and does it feel like it really resonates with you and that that matches what you're looking for in your community. And then the other thing I'd say is reach out to whichever professionals you're thinking about. I know I certainly am happy to spend half an hour or an hour on the phone with a group to sort of talk through what their needs are and whether I think I'm a good match for that. If I think somebody else is a better match, I'll tell you that. And I think that's true of most of the process folks, that they're happy to talk to you and also will let you know if they think they're going to be a good match for what you're looking for.
Or I'm always curious about experiences people have had and whether or not they were successful. I think it's still something we can learn from.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We had a new member of our community join us recently, and she came here from other co-housing communities, so she had experience. So when she arrived, she reminded us of something we'd actually learned in our early times, and we'd kind of forgotten it and we got out of practice. But anytime we brought up an issue to a meeting, a proposal or whatever, she strongly recommended that we state up front where in the 7 steps of the consensus decision-making process this is right now, you know, when the topic is introduced. And I feel like that when we got in the habit of doing that again, I feel like it helped us. The clarity was just, I found very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And, you know, every community has their own version of the consensus process. So if yours is a 7-step process, that's great. And others may have other ways. But I absolutely think part of the prep for a meeting for any facilitator is to make sure you're really clear on what the process is and where you are in it and what your intention is for that meeting. Because if you have a proposal that you're working that's already been discussed at previous meetings, that's a pretty different meeting than if you're at a stage of we're just beginning to get ideas about this and then we're going to generate a proposal for another meeting. So I think what you're saying is exactly right on, and all of that clarity, it goes to safety, that sense of structure of we know what we're about, we know what we're trying to get done, we know what the boundaries around our conversation are within the structure that we've agreed. All of that produces safety and increases trust. And that's part of contracting in a larger sense, that as a community you've made some agreements together. And you always want to check back in with folks and make sure you're still all on the same page about that. Not that you'd necessarily change it on a dime, but if there are objections, you want to know that. You don't want people sort of grumbling along with something they think they're stuck with. But in general, those processes work really well.
Unless there's somebody else who wants to ask a question, I would like to ask, I'm sure you could give a very long answer, but what facilitation approach would you use for a budget discussion initially to start with? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of answers to that. So, and it has to do in part with what your budget process is. And whether so are you starting to talk about what sort of process you want to use for your budget, or are you settled about that? And so you want to be really clear about your structure again. Some groups do a pretty straight up once a year budget. Some sort of plan on forwarding the previous year's budget and only changes get talked about. Some groups look at every item every year. Some groups have a sort of a base budget that covers the sort of standard HOA types of things, and then a pledge budget that covers other pieces that, like social events and more co-housing specific kinds of things. So that's done on a pledge basis. So there's lots of ways about it. And so it kind of depends on which of those is your approach. And all of those have advantages and disadvantages, depending on what you're looking for. I always like to have some sort of values engagement around it. So I think it's easy to think of budget discussions as sort of this painful thing of what we're paying, how much money we have to give up as a cost kind of thing. And I think framing that with what are the things that we're buying that we really value? What are the things that make us really glad that we're putting this money in is a piece of the framing. And you want to keep it as relational as possible. That's another place where it's easy to forget that relationships are on the table, but they always, always are. So making sure that you're really making room for the needs that are behind some of the things. So, if people are really struggling financially, they need a time to say that. If people are really frustrated with, and fearful, the roof's going to fall in because we're not maintaining it as well as we should, they need a time to be able to say that. So I think also allowing enough time for as much disagreement as there can be. But in terms of an exact method, it kind of depends on where you are in terms of what the process is. But tons of clarity, and somehow to have enough time available in the meeting, and usually more than one meeting. Budgets are usually big items. Does that?
Yeah.
One other thing I'd say is if there's a particularly contentious thing, like I know in our community, we had a bad storm. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, there were multiple hurricanes that came through the South. So here we were in Atlanta and we ended up with no power for about 3 days. And after that, there was a big conversation about buying a community generator. And some people absolutely wanted it and some people were really opposed. And for that one, we had meetings that were just about the generator topic. So where if you've got a big topic like that, it makes sense to just do that as its own meeting, which may not be a general meeting and it may not be where a decision's going to get made, but where you got plenty of time to talk through all the ideas and concepts, and then that group can make a proposal to take to the general meeting.
Yeah, my takeaway from that is that we should agree on process, and values should be infused into the discussion. Thank you.
Totally agree. I see a couple of questions, some things in the chat about trainings and how to get trainers that understand consensus. And I'm guessing that if you've had trainings on general facilitation from folks who don't understand consensus, that they're not co-housing specific facilitation trainers. I'm not sure how to enlighten. I mean, if you want to be trained in how to do consensus, you want to be trained by someone who has experience in consensus. Even if you can get them enlightened, they're not going to have the sort of experience knowledge base to give you the support that you need. So yeah, I would agree. I think Diane pointed out is the one saying to work with a trainer who already understands it. And certainly you can ask questions of the trainer before you hire them, but yeah, it's all well, I mean, I think it's great to spread the idea of consensus, and if people are getting facilitation training or giving facilitation training, I'd love to see them challenged to include consensus methods, but if it's not their expertise, I probably would not choose that trainer. There are a lot of misconceptions in the world about consensus. So it's very possible to get someone who knows a lot about facilitation and really does not understand the consensus model. So I would be cautious about that. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
It's kind of repeating something you already said, Karen, in a sense, but I feel like it bears repeating actually, because I think it's really important. Like, we've lived here for 9+ years now, and before we moved in, we got a mission statement and vision statement and all that other kind of stuff, and that was great. But I'm feeling now like we really need to revisit that, because I just feel like it informs everything. It's just so important to be clear about what our mission and vision are, because it actually doesn't matter what we discuss in a meeting. It goes back to that. And I feel like we've grown a bit fuzzy about that now. And, you know, I'm eager to revisit it and get clarity again. Yeah, I'll just say that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Most mission and vision statements are initially drafted before move-in, and appropriately. I mean, that's a great thing for forming communities to do. I highly recommend that. And then often communities get busy moving in and getting settled, and you know, and sort of don't look at it again for a while. And I think that mission and vision can look pretty different. I think co-housing changes people in pretty phenomenal ways. I think it's one of the reasons we need more co-housing in the world. But also that having had the experience of living in co-housing, I think a lot of groups might form or frame or experience their mission and vision differently, and not because they've abandoned it or don't value the same things, but because the way that you see them and experience them and apply them in community is different. Based on the lived experience of sharing together. I think very few of us move into co-housing with as much understanding of sort of what we're getting ourselves into. I think usually 5 years in, we all look back and go, wow, I didn't quite know how much I had to grow and learn and figure out about this community living thing, or how rich and wonderful and meaningful it could be. So I think it makes sense to revisit, and even if you're not changing anything, to relook at how do we live this, right? So we know this is our mission and our vision, but what does that look like in our budget? What does that look like in our activities? What does that look like? You know, does that shift how we think about doing meals, or does that shift how we think about sharing our property with the broader community, or whatever those things might be, with actual policies and examples in play? Anyone else? It's your opportunity to ask a facilitator anything you want to know.
So since no one else is talking, I'll just take the opportunity of saying this, that I just want to thank you so much, Karen and Corin, and not only you two, but all of the other presenters who've been involved in the series, because this has been just the most fabulous opportunity to plug into, you know, gurus of co-housing, and you know, to have access to you guys. I've just found it absolutely amazing, and I just want to thank you very much.
Well, thank you for saying that. I certainly feel that way about all the presenters that I've been able to, well, and I hear them all, because if I'm not there for some reason, I'm doing the recordings. So I've seen them all, and there is just such a rich resource in the co-housing world. So many amazing folks, and I learn from every single one of them. So I'm really excited we're able to offer them. And you all make it way more fun, I will say. Those of you, particularly those who've been coming really consistently, it's so fun to see you week after week, and having folks to join the conversation definitely makes it more fun. So thank you for being here.
Well, if nobody else has any other questions, Karen, do you want to talk a little bit about, I mean, the web chat series is going to continue, and I'll let y'all know what's next, but you are offering a couple things at the Portland conference. Do you want to just share really quick what those options are?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about the conference. I think Portland is going to be a lot of fun. I'm so impressed with the program. Our conference team has done an incredible job. And registrations are going incredibly well also. So I think there's going to be a lot of people there, and it's going to be really fun. If you haven't registered, I'd encourage you to do that. I'm doing a full day intensive talking about sort of relational practices and how to facilitate good relational experiences. So using more of with the mirroring skills and how to do more of that in groups to have those more values-based and deeper conversations. So there's that on Friday, I believe. And then I am doing a session during the workshop during the other days as well. And also a Q&A, I think, on families in co-housing. So I shall be around.
And I'll just say, I just plugged in a link into the chat that is a link to the Portland conference, to all of the information in relation to it. And there are several both pre-conference intensives as well as sessions during the main conference on Saturday, Sunday that have something to do with facilitation, communications, relationships. And if you're trying to figure out if you want to consult with a professional and you're not really sure kind of which one, as Karen was saying, that could be a great way to do that, as well as there's going to be a ton of just like networking opportunities as well. So, and I'll just say that, so that conference is June 1st and 2nd in Portland, Oregon. The pre-conference stuff is May 30th and 31st. And the early bird discount for the conference registration ends midnight on Tuesday, next Tuesday. So that's the 19th. So, and it's a pretty good deal. So you guys should check that out. A couple of other announcements I'll just make really quick. Also coming up is Open House Day. And so that's the opportunity nationwide on Saturday, April 27th. And it sure would be fun if Canada got in on that as well. So it's a day, it's once a year. And the idea is that co-housing communities all across would open their doors for a morning or an afternoon of that day and just welcome people in so they can, see the common house, see what the community is like, chat with some people. Some communities choose to do things like rent a bouncy castle or fire up the popcorn machine, and some just simply just welcome people in. And it's just kind of, letting people know a little bit about co-housing so that we can continue to spread the word. So, and I will put in the chat information on that as well. Open House Day. There's that. So the next web chat scheduled is Wednesday, March 20th, and that's Crystal Farmer, and she's going to be talking about housing segregation and its impact on co-housing, which I think will be pretty amazing. And I will plug that in here to web chat, and all of this information is available on the website as well. So you can find that. So does anybody have any other questions for Karen before we kind of wrap it up for tonight? Well, thank you guys so much for being here. And Karen, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. Super helpful. And yeah, some good information. So the web chat series is offered for free to anybody who gets a hold of the link and can sign on. The recording and the Karen's slideshow will be posted on the web chat page on the website, usually within 24 to 48 hours. It just kind of depends on the recording. So that information will be there. It does take some staff time for the web chat series to be organized and scheduled in the recording. So we always welcome donations for that. I plugged in a link to that as well in the chat. And let's see, is there anything else? Do I need to, that's what my notes say.
I think you got it.
Okay, you got it. So this information will be on the website, and we'll hopefully see you all next Wednesday.